My name is Megan Dettenmeyer. I'm the Utah State University Forestry Extension Coordinator, Education Coordinator. And I'm glad that you all have joined us today. This webinar is sponsored by the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Utah State Forestry Extension, that's me, and special guest this month, the Southern Rockies Joint Fire Science Program. So today, I'm really excited to have Joel speaking to us from Flagstaff, Arizona. He's a research geologist with the USGS. He's agreed to speak today about his recent research involving climate, wildfire, and erosion, and the impacts of these three things on watersheds in the western United States. Joel has 8.5-year-old twin boys, and I think he's probably glad that they're back in school. I don't know. But anyways, thanks a lot, Joel, for putting this presentation together for us, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. Appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to see so many people have signed up to participate in this. So I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen. I think now you guys should all be seeing my title slide. Is that correct?
Yep, looks good.
And I'm going to go ahead and just use my mouse here as a pointer, and I'm assuming you can see that pointer as well, correct?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks so much. So as Megan said, I'm Joel Sankey. I'm a research geologist with the USGS. I live here in Flagstaff, Arizona. I work for a science center called the Southwest Biological Science Center, and also another science center called the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. But today I'm going to talk to you specifically about work that we're doing using an ensemble model to make projections of watershed sediment yield as a function of future wildfire for all of the watersheds of the western USA. My collaborators on this project are Jason Kreitler, who's a research geographer with the USGS in Boise, Idaho. And I know several of these people are on the webinar today and will probably participate in any discussion or questions we have at the end as well. Todd Habacher is a research ecologist in Denver, Colorado with the USGS. Jason McVeigh worked for us as a geospatial research specialist out of Northern Arizona University here in Flagstaff. Excuse me. Mary Ellen Miller is a research professor at Michigan Tech Research Institute, and Nicole Valiant is a fire ecologist with the Forest Service in Oregon. Scott Lowe is a professor at Boise State University, and then Temulin Sankey is a professor at Northern Arizona University at the Remote Sensing and Geoinformatics Lab. Excuse me, I'll take a drink of water here periodically just to keep my throat clear. Okay, so first off, I just wanted to tell you guys that this project is funded from a grant that we got from the Department of Interior Northwest Climate Science Center. And that was for a project specifically titled Changes to Watershed Vulnerability Under Future Climate, Fire Regimes, and Population Pressures. And so today I'm going to be presenting to you, roughly the first half of this particular project that focused specifically on changes to watershed vulnerability under future climate and fire regimes. The second half of the project is underway, and that's actually going to focus on the implications of the results that I'll go through and show you today for people and human communities across the western U.S. This is the outline for my talk today. I think it'll last about 30 minutes or so from this point forward, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of just kind of background and overview about the topic kind of globally and regionally, and then also a little bit of locally for me as well. The area burned by wildfires has increased in recent decades, and it's expected to increase in the future, in the near future, in coming decades, for a lot of watersheds worldwide due to climate change. And burned areas within watersheds increase soil erosion rates, and that can increase the downstream accumulation of sediment in rivers and reservoirs. And then this can often negatively impact aquatic ecosystems, decrease water quality and supply, and increase potentially the cost of water delivery to people as well. And so on this slide here, I'm just showing you one example of a global assessment of watershed vulnerability to wildfire, and this is just from a recent paper published this year. This particular index that I'm showing you here, this map of here, the Global Wildfire Water Exposure Index, is derived from a qualitative geographic overlay of several different drivers of wildfire impacts on watersheds. And so the work that I'm going to then our work that I'm going to tell you about today is really our attempt to quantitatively model future wildfire impacts for watersheds at a regional scale across the West. So the work, as I said, that I'll show you today is focused on the Western U.S. And we focus on the West because we work and we live here, and we know that fires are expected to increase across a lot of the region in coming decades due to climate change. We're also focused on the West because many of the watersheds with projected increases in wildfire are important headwaters of rivers and reservoirs that meet the water demands of people and communities across the region. And then one statistic here that I put up that always kind of catches my eye is that 65% of the water supply in the West originates from forested watersheds that are prone to wildfire. And so it follows just from that that much of the water supply in the West is potentially vulnerable to any future increases in wildfire. So again, the work that I'm going to show you today is done at a very large geographic extent and a very large watershed scale. But I think it's fundamentally driven by the fact that so many individual communities and cities and towns across the region have already started to act on concerns about watershed vulnerability to future fire. And in particular, many communities are specifically concerned that increased fire potential due to climate change could couple with forest conditions that in many places are potentially primed for really large or potentially catastrophic type fires in the future, which could in turn increase flooding and sedimentation and negatively impact watersheds and water supply and the people that rely on a really big range of ecosystem and economic services from these watersheds. So I'm showing this particular slide here just to kind of demonstrate to you that I'm actually most familiar with one of these individual community programs in my own town of Flagstaff, and not as a scientist, but as a citizen. Flagstaff recently passed a multi-million-dollar watershed protection project that will thin forests surrounding the city and watersheds surrounding the town to reduce the risk of future catastrophic fires and subsequent flooding, erosion, and sedimentation. Okay, so excuse me. A lot of this work and my talk really hinges on the fact that, as one of my colleagues says, fire does stuff to soil. All right, I just seem to have a little bit of a frog in my throat, but I think I'll work it out here. So that stuff that fire does to soil can make water run off faster and in larger volumes after rainstorms. And that stuff can also make soil erode faster and in larger volumes due to rainfall and runoff. And then sediment, obviously, that erodes from hill slopes can ultimately end up in channels and streams and reservoirs faster and in larger volumes than would otherwise potentially occur without fire. And I think this is kind of a helpful conceptual overview that I'll walk you through that was made by this friend, colleague of mine named Joe Wagenbrenner, who said that fire does stuff to soil that we really need to pay attention to. And this is really a summary or an overview of the important state changes and processes that can cause increased runoff and erosion after moderate and high severity wildfires. So as we walk through this, you can just remember that ovals in this figure represent a change in state, and then rectangles represent the resulting change in processes. And so one of the things that fires can do is they burn or combust vegetation, which can result in a loss of plant canopy. Fires can also enhance soil water repellency, so basically make the soil surface more hydrophobic, and which means that water might infiltrate or infiltrate the soil at slower rates or potentially to a lesser degree following fire. Fire can combust litter at the ground surface and lead to a loss of ground cover on the soil surface, and it can also lead to a loss of soil organic matter by combustion of say organic rich topsoil at the soil surface. The loss of plant canopy and the loss of ground cover can reduce interception of rainfall and transpiration of water as well. The loss of ground cover specifically can reduce roughness of the soil surface. So things like microtopography or even more kind of microscale roughness at the surface. And reduced roughness can increase the velocity of flows, any fluid that flows across the surface, water or wind or air, for example. The loss of ground cover can potentially increase soil sealing. So again, making the movement of water or air in or out of the soil less likely or more difficult. Loss of ground cover and loss of soil organic matter can increase rain splash, so increase basically the potentially erosive impact of individual raindrops hitting the soil surface. Loss of soil organic matter can also just increase soil erodibility in general. Reductions in interception, transpiration, increased velocity of flows across the ground surface, increased soil sealing can all potentially increase runoff. So increase base flow, peak flows, water yield for individual hill slopes or channels, watersheds within burned areas. And then increases in runoff, increased rain splash, increased velocity, increased soil erodibility. Can all potentially then, in conjunction with increased runoff, increase soil erosion. And that's for a really wide variety of erosion processes. So things like rain splash, sheet wash, rilling, gullying, mass wasting like debris flows, and landslides after wildfires. Okay, so that's kind of the general background and kind of overview of the topic and work that I wanted to give you. And I'll just spend a couple of slides here just sort of giving you the general premise for the work here and also tell you specifically about the objectives of the work. And I mentioned some of these bullets in my very first slide, but I'm just going to go through each of them. So again, the area burned by fires has increased in recent decades and is expected to increase in the future for a lot of the West as a function of climate change. And that's particularly true for warmer climate change projections. Burned areas within watersheds can increase soil erosion rates, which can increase the downstream accumulation of sediment in rivers and reservoirs. And increased sediment can impact aquatic ecosystems, decrease the water quality and supply potentially, and increase costs of water delivery to people. And so I think it's really important to understand how changing fire frequency, extent, and location will affect watersheds and ecosystem services that watersheds supply to communities across the West. With all that said, it's really not very well known, at least at kind of a regional assessment sort of scale, which watersheds are most likely to be dramatically impacted by future potential wildfires. And so the objective of this work that I'm showing you is really to try to answer the question, or at least ask the question of how will post-fire sedimentation change in Western U.S. watersheds as a function of future fire. So now let's spend a little bit of time going through and talking about the methods that we use for this work. And at a simplest level, our methods really involve combining, an ensemble or combination of numbers 1, 2, 3 that I'm showing you on this figure to make estimates for the future of number 4 here. So, we combine predictions of future fire as a function of or due to climate change with predictions of watershed sediment yield due to fire to make then projections of future water sediment yield as a function of future fire. And the reality is that this has been, primarily or in large part a data synthesis type project, because the future wildfire projections that we've been working with were previously published by the USGS and by specifically Todd Habacher, somebody on our group, based on several different future climate scenarios. And then at least one set of Western-wide predictions of post-fire soil erosion had been published prior to the project. And then we also incorporated some of our own additional sets of post-fire soil erosion predictions from different GIS models to make the ensemble. So that's kind of the general methods, and now I'll go through this slide, and then we'll talk more specifically about some of the individual data sets as well that went into this. So fundamentally, the data that went into the ensemble projections of future post-fire watershed sediment yield are shown with these maps here. And I'll walk you through each source, in more detail in the next several slides, but I wanted to show you the overview here. So again, we used projections of future fire and burned area that were summarized by decade, from the first decade of 2001 to 2010 to the last decade of our study, 2041 to 2050. And then the fire projections themselves are based on 3 different climate change scenarios, which are labeled here as the A1, B, A2, and B1 scenarios. And then we used estimates of watershed scale sediment yield here, C, D, and E that I'm showing you in this figure, due to post-fire erosion from 3 different GIS models. And one of those is based on something called the GeoWeb model, and then 2 different ones are based on sort of different implementations of something called the Russell model. The data from A, B, C, and D that I'm showing you are already published by various members of the team that I highlighted on my title slide of the talk. And so then I just wanted to finish up on this slide just to point out that, so we're talking about this ensemble of 3 climate fire scenarios by 3 erosion models to make these ensemble projections of post-fire watershed sediment yield. And ensemble models are commonly used in the climate change science community to improve prediction accuracy and characterize prediction uncertainty. But I think they're less commonly used in, the geosciences or geomorphology type disciplines like we have here in our project. And so I think this is actually one of the, maybe somewhat simple, but also very novel contributions of our work. We've essentially used, reasonable data from several different models and sources to not only make estimates of future post-fire sediment yield, but also to quantify the uncertainty of our projections. Okay, so now let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of the different input data sets. And first we'll talk about the future fire projections. So these, existing data prior to our project of burned area projections were published by Habacher and Zhu in this USGS professional paper in 2012. And again, Todd is one of the team members on our project here and co-author in this talk. They, again, made these projections of area burned and burned area summaries or perimeters. And at an annual scale, so annually from 2000 to 2050, and then for these 3 different climate change scenarios, A1, B, A2, and B1. For our project here and the data I'm talking about that went into our ensemble model work, Todd summarized those projections by decade, so 5 different decades between 2000 and 2050, and then by the 3 different climate change scenarios. And down here in the bottom of this slide, I'm just showing you an example here of what a map of those data look like. In this case, it's the change or the average change, averaged among the 3 different climate change scenarios of area burned, projected for that first decade, 2000 to 2010, or 2001 to 2010, I should say, to the decade of 2041 to 2050. Obviously, watershed showing up as, yellow, orange, and red are projected to have a greater increase in burned area as a function of changes in fire due to climate change over the, through the middle of this century. And then one kind of take-home message or finding that came out of their eye-catching statistic maybe that came out of their projections that I wanted to just point out is that they projected that fire ignitions could increase by up to 74% by the middle of the century, by 2050, and that burned area could potentially increase by up to 95% by 2050. Okay, so the first year post-fire sediment yield estimates that we're using in this work are again from 3 different GIS models. And so one is the process-based GeoWeb model. And then the SRM and the SDR models, I've labeled there with those names, are both based on kind of different implementations of the empirical Russell Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. And we use something called the INVEST suite of tools for this work. If people want to ask questions specifically about that at the end, feel free to do so. The GeoWeb and the SRM estimates were previously published, and then the SDR estimates were produced by our team just a little more recently here in the past year or so. In these particular maps, the watershed showing up as a yellow, orange, and red are those that are estimated to have the greatest first-year post-fire sediment yields. And then as well, I just noticed that the GeoWeb covers a different extent, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation today. Okay, so all of the models for the soil erosion work are post-fire hill slope soil erosion estimates that really focus on specifically the contribution of hill slope erosion specifically to watershed sediment yield. And so that means that they don't really capture additional post-fire sediment yield due to other important processes like landslides or debris flows, for example, or stream channel erosion or even wind erosion. And so this is an important caveat to point out. And actually, one of my own interests for future work is to try to incorporate additional sediment models to make a more holistic accounting of all possible post-fire erosion processes. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the end of the talk as well. But I think this particular table that I'm showing you is just kind of helpful to illustrate some of the strengths, but also the limitations of the models that we've worked with so far. The SRM and the SDR models that I showed you on this previous slide here have the characteristics that are outlined here in this table with this kind of yellow box at the top. And then the GeoWeb model have the predictions and or the GeoWeb predictions, have the characteristics that are outlined in this orange box here in this table. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit specifically about the GeoWeb estimates using this slide here. And what you're seeing here is a slide that describes the workflow that was used by Mary Ellen Miller, who's one of the co-authors on my talk today, to make the GeoWeb post-fire soil erosion predictions. And she published these back in 2011. She did this for all of the major forested and woodland areas of the western U.S. And so that's where I was pointing out to you on an earlier slide that just noticed the extent of the GeoWeb predictions or estimates. It doesn't span, the entire West. And one of the things about doing this kind of work at this, sort of large geographic extent and really large watershed scale is that it can be really difficult to try to validate these types of predictions over such large areas. And so this plot here is just an example of her validation results for predicted erosion as a function of measured erosion for several watersheds. I think specifically here in Colorado, I believe. So obviously the first thing you notice is that predictions obviously aren't perfect. And I think, some of that could have as much to do with how difficult it is to accurately measure watershed scale post-fire erosion out in the field and watersheds in the place. But one of the really important things that I want to point out to you is that we use the errors from these types of validations like you're seeing here in this plot to characterize the uncertainties of our own projections. And I'll explain to you later on in the talk how we do that. And then I just wanted to tell you a little bit here too about the SRM predictions and how we calibrated and validated those. So we calibrated and validated those SRM or Russell-based post-fire soil erosion predictions using a database of post-fire sediment yield measurements that came out of this review that was published by John Moody and Deborah Martin from the USGS. And that was a review from the literature and then synthesis as well of those published data of historical fires across the West, and also published measurements of post-fire sediment yield from those fires. So similar to that scatter plot I showed you, the validation from the GeoWeb predictions from Mary Miller's paper, this is what they look like here in this case for the SRM predictions of watershed sediment yield, tons per hectare in this case, predicted from the model versus those published from that Moody and Martin synthesis or review paper. So again, you know, the predictions obviously aren't perfect, but again, I think some of that could have as much to do, or could have a lot to do, with how difficult it is to accurately measure watershed scale post-fire erosion. But again, we use the errors that we see from these type of validations to characterize the uncertainties of our own projections. And I just wanted to show you here one last slide, and then we'll move on, and I'll show you some actual results from the work. This is just a comparison in this case of the predictions of first-year post-fire sediment yield from the GeoWeb model plotted versus from the SRM predictions. And so we just thought it was encouraging that, you know, when we compared these estimates from two different models, one being a process-based model and one being an empirical model, that there was, you know, a reasonable correlation between the two. Okay, so now let's move on and let's talk about the really key results from our work. And this is a map here on this slide of what I think are probably the most key results, or sort of eye-catching results from our work. Basically, in order to reduce, you know, the data that we generated and the projections among the different decades and climate change scenarios and different models, we calculated a relative percent change in post-fire sediment yield from the first decade study, 2001 to 2010, to the last, 2041 to 2050. And so that's what this map is showing. So in this map, 84%, or you know, a little more than 3/4 of all of the watersheds on the map, and there are 809 of these Huckade watersheds across the West. So a little more than 3/4 of those are projected to undergo more than a 10% increase in post-fire sedimentation as a function of future fire. And so that would be the watersheds that are basically showing up as everything other than these blue colors on the map. 29% of all of the watersheds in the study area, or, you know, a little more than 1/4, are projected to undergo more than 100% increase. And so that would be a doubling of post-fire sediment yield by basically the middle of the century, 2041 to 2050. And so that would be in the map, you know, all the watersheds showing up as this kind of darker yellow color, orange and red. And then 1% of the watersheds are projected to undergo more than 1,000% increase. And that's the watershed showing up as red on the map. So one important thing to point out, based on those results I just showed you, is that the results vary by the different climate change scenarios and the different erosion models, as you might imagine. And then they also vary by, you know, what watersheds we consider or summarize them for across the West. And so I put this table in here just to help illustrate that point. Miller et al., you know, as I showed you earlier, did that GeoWeb modeling for just the primary forested and woodland areas of the West. Whereas, you know, for these maps that I'm showing you and the work with some of both the fire projections and also the other soil erosion models, we went ahead and completed the maps and the projections for all the watersheds, which includes, you know, some desert and ag land areas that maybe, you know, are not appropriate to include in the projections. And then one other important note that I wanted to point out here is that the projected increases are greater for the warmer climate change scenarios that we considered. And so that would be the A1B and the A2 scenarios of the three. So more watersheds are projected to have, you know, relatively large increases in post-fire sediment yield for those two warmer climate change scenarios. So I showed you the relative percent change in post-fire sediment yield from the beginning of the century to the middle of the century. But another way to summarize the results is to calculate the absolute change in post-fire sediment in megagrams of sediment. And so that's what these maps are showing here. One showing the mean or the average absolute change, and the other showing the standard error of that absolute change. from the first decade to the last. The standard error is obviously, a measure of variability in the projections by the 3 climate fire scenarios and then the 3 erosion models. One of the things I was going to tell you about these maps, and specifically about comparing the two, is that the standard error is less than half of the mean percent change for 52% of all the watersheds. And the standard error is larger, so large relative to the mean, for 21% of the watersheds. And so that gives us, one idea about variability and projected changes in sediment yield, and suggests that actually that variability could be, potentially relatively small for a majority of watersheds. But now here in the next few slides, I'm going to talk specifically about a more sort of specific and robust uncertainty analysis that we did for the projections. Okay, so I just showed you the key results summarized across the different climate fire scenarios and erosion models. And I want to explain then, how we specifically characterize uncertainty in the projections. Here's what the projections look like of post-fire sediment yield for each of the 5 decades and the 3 erosion models, but specifically just for that A1B climate change scenario. This is what those results look like specific for the A2 climate scenario and then the B1 scenario. And so you can see there is, variability and changes for some different watersheds and different parts of the region as I flip through those. But basically, those are the data that describe the variability in the ensemble projections. And so we used that to do an uncertainty analysis that was specifically using a Monte Carlo simulation approach. And we really focused on uncertainties due to kind of what we thought of as 4 sort of key sources of uncertainty in our projections, and kind of assumptions of the modeling and data synthesis that we did. One of those key uncertainties we describe or call just simply the relatively simple nature of the erosion modeling using that GeoWeb and also GIS implementation of the Russell model. Another key source of uncertainty is this assumption that future erosion response to fire will be equal to that of the recent past. And there I just mean specifically that the validation, the predictions that I showed you, and also both the calibration and validation work for the GeoWeb and the Russell-based work is based on comparing it to historical fires, but really historical fires from recent past decades. There's another key source of uncertainty in that we didn't explicitly incorporate burn severity, variability in burn severity, even though actually the fire projections themselves that Habak and Zhu published do vary by burn severity. And so then we did in turn incorporate that as an uncertainty term in this uncertainty analysis. And then the last key source of uncertainty is just the fact deals with the idea or the issue of non-stationarity of rainfall as we move into the future. And the fact that climate, and specifically the effects of rainfall for soil erosion, may not be stationary, through the 5-decade time frame of our projections. So basically, we have these 4 key sources of uncertainty, and we incorporate them into error terms, and a kind of a stepwise progression of estimates of thousands of realizations of each of these 4 different key inputs into the model. So there's the annual post-fire sediment yield, the amount of erosion and then sediment that is produced at a watershed scale due to erosion during the first year after a wildfire, typically. And then there's the future burn area projections, and then the combination of those 2, which are really our ultimate projections of future post-fire sediment yield per watershed and decade. We take all of those multiple realizations of that final outcome product of the projections by watershed and decade, and then just use a t-test for each individual watershed to test specifically the hypothesis that post-fire sediment yield in the decade of 2041 to 2050 is significantly greater than the decade of 2001 to 2010. So from that uncertainty analysis, we found that the projected increase in post-fire sediment between the first and the last decade is significant for at least 9/10 of the watersheds that have a projected relative percent change in post-fire sediment of more than 10%. So essentially, those watersheds that are projected to have relatively large increases in post-fire sediment by the middle of the century, those projections tend to be statistically significant. That's one way to think about that. The results, of the uncertainty analysis did show that the potential errors around any individual model estimate of erosion or fire can certainly be large. But we also think that the results also clearly showed that the projected increases in erosion are statistically significant for a majority of watersheds, and that we used relatively conservative estimates of uncertainty, those key sources of uncertainty. And so one of the reasons that we think that the projected increases in erosion are significant is presumably just because the projected increases in burned area are so substantial. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through kind of the summary slides here and tell you about some of the next steps of our work, and then we can move on to questions. So as far as we know, this is the first research to use an ensemble of climate, fire, and erosion models to predict variability in post-fire sediment yield at a watershed scale across the West as a function of future wildfire conditions. And specifically, we project a significant increase in watershed sedimentation across the Western USA in coming decades due to climate-driven changes in fire. And project that post-fire sedimentation could increase for more than 3/4 of all the watersheds across the West by at least 10% by the middle of the century, and that post-fire sedimentation could increase for more than 1/4 of all watersheds by at least 100%, or a doubling, by the middle of the century. So those are pretty, I guess, sort of dramatic, eye-catching projections. So the next steps for our work is, first off, that all the data that I showed you today, and also a publication based on this, are currently in review. The projections data will be, they'll ultimately be published by the USGS, and they'll be openly available for others as soon as they are published. And the big reason that we do this kind of work is we want to create useful data that other people can use. And I think there's probably a myriad of potential uses and ways that people can use and also validate our predictions as well. And so we're looking forward to see how people use them, and hoping that people do. And then our team is going to specifically work with projections to focus on implications for watersheds and water supply for communities across the West. So if you remember back at the beginning of my talk, I summarized our methods with this slide. But when you get to the end of a project like this, you realize that there's always ways you could improve it, and you'd like to go back in and work on this some more. And so now we're actually focusing on developing what I think of as an even more holistic assessment of post-fire sediment, due not only to hill slope erosion, but also post-fire debris flow, landslide processes. And that's in collaboration with USGS scientists and a team who are really experts on that type of modeling. We then want to use as well future stream flow projections to estimate the effects of increased post-fire sediment and what they might be on stream channels and stream channel geomorphology, specifically across the West. So I'll just finish up by reminding you that the project was supported by a grant from the Northwest Climate Science Center, the Department of Interior. And then I just wanted to, here at the very end, scroll through 3 different slides with 3 different web pages where the data will be available once it's published, and also where more info about the project will reside. And so there's this Northwest Climate Science Center project webpage. There's also a National Climate Change and Wildfire Science Center webpage. And then there's also a USGS science-based webpage where the data will reside once it's reviewed and published by the USGS. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks,
Just a
Joel.
real quick note, Joel, if any, you or maybe if any of your colleagues online who you said do this research, those last few slides with the links, if someone who's online has those links and would put those in chat, that would be probably really helpful for folks. They
Okay.
would just click on the link and they've got it there. Go ahead.
Can I just say, Jason Kreidler, maybe if you're out there, would you stick those in the chat?
Yeah, Joel, I was just going to say, you know, the reason that I invited you was because of those big, you know, scary predictions about sediment increases. And I know nothing about sediment. I have a lot of colleagues that study it. And so that was one of the reasons that I just thought, man, this guy has to come and give us a talk. So, you know, we don't necessarily have people that study stream, you know, geomorphology on the webinar today. We have a lot of on-the-ground practitioners that might be thinking back to that map where, you know, their watershed was that red watershed highlighted there.
Right.
You know, thinking, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do? I'm just a forester or a city planner. You know, and that's a scary thing for a lot of these people to think about. And I'm not one of those people, but I'm scared for them, you know. So what can you offer us any sort of maybe not advice, but guidance as we're navigating this study?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, first off, we did this at a really large regional scale, large watershed scale, and we were picturing it as identifying, you know, watersheds or maybe sort of sub-regions that were going to be potentially real hotspots in sedimentation. So I think one way, again, it's potentially useful, and actually one of the reasons that at the very beginning of the talk, I talked specifically about Flagstaff and the watershed protection project here that I know about as a citizen, is that, you know, I think probably individual communities, resource managers could look at just this map alone and say, okay, you know, does our community fall in one of these sort of hotspot watersheds? And if so, do we already have a watershed protection plan or some sort of an action plan in place? And if so, then, you know, probably they're on top of it. You know, conversely, I would imagine there are at least some communities out there that might look at this and say, oh, we hadn't realized, you know, that we might be a real hotspot for these kind of future changes. So yeah, at a very sort of simple level, I think that's potentially one of the most useful outcomes of this.
So in Flagstaff specifically, they're doing a lot of thinning, active thinning.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. I see Zach Roberts had a question here. What is being? I don't know if you prefer to read it, but just click on the Q&A tab down there.
Okay. Sure, you want me to read it? So this is from Zach Roberts. Mm-hmm. It says, what's being done to mitigate the amount of sediment that enters waterways as a result of forest fires? Is the approach to prevent fires, or is the approach to react and remove sediment from waterways? You know, again, I'm a scientist, not a resource manager, but I would say different communities are maybe responding or proactively sort of planning for it in different ways. As I described, you know, and you know, for example, here in Flagstaff, there's, you know, thinning going on to basically reduce the risk of future, you know, really large catastrophic fires. But then there's also, you know, work that communities will do specifically to engineer, you know, either channels and or sort of catchment areas or basically sediment kind of retention type reservoirs or ponds to keep the sediment from, say, flowing into individual neighborhoods or damaging infrastructure. So I would say both from my understanding. But, you know, if people out there on the WebEx also are these kind of managers and practitioners, if they want to chime in too, that'd be great. There's another question. Should I go ahead and just keep going?
And the other question, and then there's also another question in the chat pod. So whichever you feel inclined to open up.
Okay. So right now I'm looking in the Q&A. Is that
okay? Yep.
Okay. So Kevin Badek asked, under climate change scenarios, did you assume the vegetation recovered to the pre-burn state, i.e. no conversion of forested systems to shrublands? And so that's encapsulated in one of those kind of key uncertainties that I touched on, which was basically that we were saying, you know, one of the sources of uncertainty and limitations to the work was that we assumed that the future response to fire in terms of how much erosion sediment occurred would be comparable to the recent past. And obviously if fires are burning so frequently, that vegetation doesn't have the chance to recover to something comparable to, the recent past or whatever those pre-burn antecedent conditions were, then your predictions will be off and will overestimate the amount of sediment produced. And so in that uncertainty analysis that I walked you through, we did try to account for that, specifically looking at how frequently fires were projected to burn, and then also making estimates of what the variability or variance might be in those projections, as a function of basically the lack of recovery and a change in the amount of fuel there was for fires to burn.
Great.
You said there was something in the chat box?
Yeah, so
get into that one.
Chat, let's see.
Oh, I see chat. Okay. I think that one popped up before what's in my Q&A.
So Lewis asked or put a question in the chat, but it's also now in the Q&A. But notice Nevada burns a lot.
Okay. Notice Nevada burns a lot. Did you use forest ignition dynamics for Nevada shrublands using various GCM? Forest ignition does not apply to shrublands, which require more moisture to build fine fuels, which then burn during a dry period. Our predictions show less fire in Nevada shrublands because more climate-induced droughts. And I don't know, let's see if anybody responded. I was thinking maybe Nicole Valiant from our group might be able to chime in and help me try to answer that question. Todd Habacher would really be the one we'd have to pose that to, because he did publish the projection work.
It looks like Nicole is online. Nicole, if you're comfortable with it, we can promote you to a panelist if you have live audio, if you just want to let us know that in chat.
You're welcome to skip ahead to another question while we're waiting.
Sure. Richard Edwards asked, if you break your approach down to the Huck 12 sub-watershed level, do you think your results will be more accurate? So that's kind of interesting. I was, whether they would actually be more accurate.
Can you tell us what Huck 12 is?
So Huck 12 would basically be kind of the Huck 8s are very large watersheds. And so the Huck 8, he's talking about breaking things down to a smaller sub-watershed scale, so smaller watersheds within these watersheds that we looked at. That was one, I think back to your very first question, Megan, about how these projections are useful to practitioners or resource managers. And we thought that basically, these models are appropriate for this kind of a large regional scale assessment in large watersheds. But actually, you'd probably use, at least I think I would use different soil erosion models, and specifically if I were to be doing this work at more, say, a sub-watershed scale, or I at least would use something like the GeoWeb and parameterize it differently probably than we have up to this point. And for that work that I talked about, where we want to try to incorporate as well sediment from debris flows and landslides after wildfires, that work is typically done at kind of a smaller, say, sub-watershed or individual mountain range, or portion of an individual mountain range scale. And so I think, if one of our next thinkings or lines of work was you could focus on some of these specific hotspots, but then you'd really want to do, if a community didn't have a protection plan in place and you wanted to make more accurate projections, you could do that at a finer sub-watershed scale, but you'd want to pull in probably some different models.
Real quick, I have a personal question. So did the city of Flagstaff ask you to advise them on their plan? Okay.
Nope, not at all. Nope.
Yeah.
Looks like Nicole said, I don't have a microphone. I'm trying to find the questions specific to Nevada to better be able to answer it.
She can't see, attendees can't see the
the Q&A, right?
Yeah, let me see if
Let's just see if I can scroll up, and I'll repeat it again from Lewis.
Yeah, go ahead.
Copy. It's going to everyone. So it's now underneath Nicole here. I guess my answer is I don't know specifically the sort of the nuanced details of the different forest ignition dynamics type modeling for shrublands versus forest or woodlands.
So Jody has a question. If you scroll up in the chat.
Sure. It says here, Jody Norris. One, any thoughts on the challenges of communicating data effectively when there are issues of how meaningful is a high % increase in a watershed that has almost no current sediment input, for example, in Northeast Arizona, or areas that have large absolute increases, but it's not adjusted for the area of the polygon, some of the very large Great Basin polygons. So I think, essentially she's saying, you have, for example, you're still looking at my screen, this was the mean % change, basically from the beginning to the middle of the century. But then I also showed you absolute changes, in terms of the amount of sediment, grams of sediment. And she's just pointing out that there's issues basically with both of those and understanding kind of how meaningful that change is. And so I guess the really short answer to that is that's why we've made both types of estimates, and we're summarizing them in both ways. Obviously, a % increase might seem like a large number, but might be potentially really significant in watersheds that are upstream of communities or contain communities that really rely on surface water, and also are places that historically maybe haven't typically had a lot of sediment input due to fires. And might be less important. Those % changes could be less important in watersheds where they already have quite a bit of sediment that's produced, and it's just a much larger %. So I guess the short answer there is that's why we're showing both. And then Jody also asked how fine a scale could these data work at, and I think that probably goes back to I think it's appropriate to be looking at this at the 8 level, like we have with these 809 different watersheds. But I think you'd want to go in, if you were going to look at sort of sub-watersheds within any one of these, and, for example, do some more specific or more detailed additional modeling, say with the GeoWeb model, in conjunction with the fire projections.
Looks like Nicole.
Did Nicole answer?
I think so.
Oh, I see right there. Okay. I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. Nicole said, I believe the large fire simulated FSIM was the model used for talk work. And so in that model, ignitions are randomly placed based on historic patterns. I'm not positive how vegetation was changed in the future scenarios, but yes, if droughts become more prevalent and reduce fuels, loads, and continuity, that will likely result in fewer and smaller fires. So thanks, Nicole, for stepping in and answering that.
I'm looking for more questions.
I'm scrolling through the chat.
I think we might have got all of them.
Jason Kreitler did stick the links in there,
Okay, great.
which Mark asked for. And I guess I understand this was recorded and we placed up on YouTube, is that right? So
it will be, yeah.
It'll be recorded, and I think Megan will follow up with an email. Folks can also go to I just put a link in chat for Learn, and we'll have a link to the recording at the Learn event page too. So
okay, great.
Joel, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen if you like.
Okay.
Okay, last chance for questions, folks.
Well, Joel, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. The next webinar will be in just under 2 weeks, so please mark your calendars for September 13th. Randy Swati from the Nature Conservancy will be joining us, and he's going to be talking about something that many of the participants might be interested in today. The title of his talk is From Pixels to Landscapes, Leveraging Land Fire for Land Management. So please mark your calendars for September 13th. Thanks again, Joel.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Megan.
Thanks, Mark. And keep your eyes out for a YouTube link for the webinar if you're interested. So thanks again. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.